What is mountain biking? Is this mountain biking? Or maybe it's this. But it could be this. Or is it this? Well, that is the question I'm going to try to answer here for you today. So, to answer this question, we have to go back in time a bit. Um, Back in the 70s, and some of you probably already know this story. There's a pretty well known name out there, Gary Fisher, and a few other people that were riding Mount Tam, which is north of San Francisco, and they had these like beach cruiser bikes, and they were bombing downhill, and they were modifying these bikes. Some of them had coaster brakes. There's always the stories about how they had to repack their coaster brake after every run and stuff like that because they would overheat. You know, kind of some cool stuff, bombing down these fire roads and stuff on their, modified beach cruiser bikes, right? Well, supposedly that's where mountain biking got its start, right? Um, so it was really downhill for the most part. But as it evolved, they wanted more gears, they wanted more capability to get more places. And by the late 70s and then going into the early 80s, they started to go with most bikes at that time, were drop bar road bike style bikes that had gears, and they had two rings in the front and five in the back, and then I think six made the 10 speed into a 12 speed, so six in the back, two in the front, stuff like that. But what really was a game changer with mountain biking was when they started doing triple rings up front. So you had three gears up front. You had the small one, the medium one, and the big one. And then you had, I don't remember if it was six or seven by then at the beginning, but it was something like that. I want to say it was 3x6, and then shortly after 3x7 for 21 speeds. But that was basically kind of in the very beginning of what mountain biking was. Somewhere in the 80s, the bike industry realized that mountain bike was kind of a funky term for bicycles that people were riding everywhere. They weren't just riding them in the mountains. People would buy a mountain bike just to ride on the road and to commute with and stuff like that. But they became super popular. It was just all of a sudden this boom. So companies tried to start calling them all-terrain bikes, ATBs, things like that. But the term just never quite stuck. It would have made more sense had we called them all-terrain bikes and then kind of got away from this idea that a mountain bike is made for riding in the mountains, right? But it just never stuck, and so the term mountain biking stuck. And that was just, it is what it is, right? So that was kind of how it got created and started, and the 80s was really the time when mountain biking kind of came to fruition, at least to the rest of the world and to what we understand as mountain biking today. And what's interesting about the 80s is there wasn't really any trail organizations. There wasn't anybody really developing trails in all these different places around the world. There was probably a few, but for the most part, we rode our mountain bikes on like hiking trails and equestrian trails and snowmobile trails and gravel roads or whatever. Like, we kind of just took them wherever, and then we also would kind of start making our own rogue single track trails, as we used to call them, because there wasn't any like official organization building these trails. There was just a bunch of us on our bikes that were like, hey, we want to put a trail here, so we'd put a trail in some wooded area somewhere. So that was where it got its start. I'm not going to get too much into the advocacy of mountain biking and how rogue trails became legitimate trails and all of that. I'm going to do a whole nother video on that. I want to talk more specifically of the types of mountain biking and how it really evolved to what it is today, and a little bit about where it might be a little confusing to people about what mountain biking actually is. Right? So let's get into that. So I got into mountain biking in the late 80s, around 87. And it's interesting because when I got into mountain biking, I was a hardcore BMX rider. And so my idea of what mountain biking was very different than I think a lot of other people's idea of what mountain biking was. When I saw mountain bikers in the 80s, I used to joke because I used to call them road bikers on dirt. They'd wear their tights and their kits, and they'd be on a mountain bike, and they'd be all tucked and going fast. It was basically that's what it was. It was road biking on dirt, right? And a lot of road bikers embrace mountain biking and so on and so forth. So, coming from the BMX perspective, I almost kind of made fun of it. I was young. That was just the way we were back then. But when I got my first mountain bike, I wanted to do like gnarly stuff. I was trying to climb like steep hills. I wanted to use that little granny gear to climb these challenging hills. And there were these trails not too far from my house called the Cedar Lake Trails or Cedar Trails. And I would go there, and there were a couple of these little steep, quick uphill climbs. And I don't live in the mountains. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and it's not flat like everybody thinks it is. I mean, it's kind of, just generally hilly, but there's definitely no mountains. So any kind of climbing that we had was going to be short, punchy climbs and things like that. But, we had this kind of mound in the middle of this trail system, and there wasn't really any distance to it. It was just rip around and basically I treated it kind of like I treated BMX, right, in these trails. But one of the other things I did was I would go ride urban with my mountain bike. No idea why, but I'd jump off loading docks and stuff. My bike didn't like that very much. There was no suspension. The parts weren't, built to handle that kind of riding. I'd bend cranks. I bent my fork. Just did all kinds of stuff. But, I was a BMX kid on a mountain bike, and so I treated my mountain bike kind of like a BMX bike with gears. So I could get places that I couldn't get on my BMX bike. So, kind of what was going on in mountain biking at that time was very different than how I perceived mountain biking. And as we got into the 90s, I actually started racing mountain bikes. And I remember I always ran BMX pedals on my mountain bike, and I kind of always didn't understand why people wanted toe straps or whatever on their feet. Well, once I started racing, I quickly learned that if I wanted to be competitive, I needed toe straps, right? To get that pull and get that power, and I needed to raise my seat because I never liked raising my seat either, and things like that. So I had to go through this learning period and be kind of fall into what the mainstream of what mountain biking was. But most mountain biking back then was all like single track riding. It was riding single track. Sometimes there would be a little bit of a challenge, some rocks, some logs, or sticks in the trail, things like that. But there certainly weren't jumps and gnarly things, at least not where I grew up riding mountain biking. And it's interesting because in the 90s was also when downhill started to happen. I remember John Tomac and those guys racing downhill, and they were on hardtails and stuff like that. Suspension forks were just starting to come around, but they were pretty poor. So 90s was kind of this evolutionary period of kind of what I would call road biking on dirt and make fun of, and until later on becoming more extreme, some more downhill, some more that stuff. And I'm pretty sure downhill mountain biking never really went away. Like, I'm sure people always out west or in the mountains were bombing down hills on their mountain bikes. I mean, I don't see why they would have ever stopped doing that. It just, that mountain biking kind of went on this much wider spectrum of pretty much being the all-purpose bike that everybody was buying and riding and people were commuting on them, and before mountain bikes came around, everybody had a 10 speed or something like that, or maybe a 3 speed with the kind of curved handlebar or whatever. But when mountain bikes came around, it was kind of a game changer, and it became like the default bike people would go to for transportation even. So very different, and kind of interesting on how it evolved. So as we get into the 2000s, mountain biking had evolved quite a bit. We're now, by the late 90s, we're getting into full suspension bikes. I remember the Trek Y bikes and stuff like that. Some pretty wild designs of full suspension bikes. And by the early 2000s, full suspension bikes started to calm down a little bit, I'd like to say, become a little bit more legit. The earlier models were pretty far out there and so on and so forth. But it was very interesting evolution of mountain biking. And I remember also in the early 2000s, the 26-inch DJ bike came out. Like, that was kind of this, like, whoa, what is that? I got a Specialized P2. It did have a derailleur and gears, but that didn't last very long. I ended up taking all that off because I hated jumping my bike with gears, and I saw other dirt jump bikes that didn't have gears, so I was like, yeah, why not just have it be a single speed, right? So what really, to just kind of fast forward to today, because aside from like geometry and things like that, bikes kind of started to stabilize a little bit, and then we got into wheel sizes, 29ers, and that 27.5 middle ground came out. 26-inch wheels have pretty much completely gone away, except for the 26-inch wheel DJ bike. So but aside from that, by the early and mid 2000s, mountain biking had kind of gotten its foothold. Trail organizations were all over the place. Trails were built. They were actually starting to open up bike parks. In 2006, I went to Whistler, stuff like that. So definitely that was when mountain biking became like into fruition as pretty mainstream, and all these categories started popping up. So that brings us to this whole point of, what is mountain biking? Like if we go back to where it began and to where it is today, it can be really confusing, right? And so confusing that if you really wanted to, you could say gravel biking is mountain biking, because weren't they riding gravel roads and fire roads back in the 70s, right? So really it kind of, it gets confusing when you hear the term mountain biking. So when you hear the term mountain biking, what do you think? Like, if somebody says, I'm going mountain biking, what immediately comes to your mind of what that is? It's kind of an interesting question. So, earlier at the intro, I posted a picture of somebody riding a pump track on a 26-inch DJ bike. Is that mountain biking? I mean, it certainly seems to kind of come from mountain biking. I think these flow trails and things kind of evolved to being more of an isolated, pump track in a little circuit kind of thing, and now they're kind of popping up all over the place. But, if you really look at a pump track, it looks an awful lot like a BMX racetrack, right? So is a pump track more BMX or more mountain biking? I don't know, right? Like, see, you could really get super confusing on this, and you can certainly ride a BMX bike on a pump track, because that's what I prefer to ride on a pump track. So, and I've seen skateboards on it, inline skates, scooters, right? So, mountain biking kind of covers kind of a wide swath of things. If you were to ask me, like, what is mountain biking, and I was to describe it, my opinion of what mountain biking is falls more into the category of riding single track. Pedaling, riding, tight, twisty, or less tight, twisty single track through the woods, through the prairies, whatever it is, whatever kind of terrain you have. Or if we go out west, I've ridden Fruta, lots of single track kind of on the, hillsides and cliffs there. I've ridden Whistler, places like that. And by Whistler, I've ridden a lot of the single track trails, not necessarily the mountain. I have ridden the mountain, but there's a lot of like trails around there and stuff too. I've been all over the country, Bentonville, places like that. And most of the mountain biking that I've encountered is mostly single track trail. Now there's different skill levels of that. There's, kind of your green trail for beginners and things like that. Then you get to your, blue trail or intermediate trail, which gets a little more technical. You might have some log rolls or a few more challenges, things like that. Then you get to your black trail and your red trails and things like that. But in my eyes, most of mountain biking is that. It's like riding single track. If you get out onto the coast where there are actually mountains, you get a much kind of more technical and more extreme version. The channel I watch, the Hardtail Party channel, he rides in Sedona, and I watch the stuff he rides. Very similar to Fruta, by the way. Like Fruta and Sedona have a lot of similar traits on the terrain, but that is definitely more technical. So somebody from those parts of the country probably have to up their skill level a bit more to get into mountain biking than somebody here in the Midwest, where there's a lot of trails that are pretty, easy when I think about places like Sedona, right? It varies. It's kind of a wide range of things. And then we have kind of these offshoots, and I'm going to call them offshoots because I don't think they're the primary main part of what mountain biking is. They're kind of splinters off of mountain biking, and that would be downhill, like enduro racing, downhill racing, and things like that. Bike parks, high skill level things, drops, jump lines, things like that is kind of another offshoot of mountain biking. And then, at the beginning I posted a picture of somebody riding a pump track. Well, what is a pump track? Where does that fall, right? It's kind of wild when you start thinking about it. So there are a lot of offshoots from the primary form of what mountain biking is. I do think that a lot of the YouTube channels and marketing and stuff definitely have that more extreme component of what mountain biking is. Jumps, drops, things like that. But there's a reason for that. It's that because that stuff is entertaining. It's fun to look at. It's fun to watch. It's not fun to watch somebody ride just some single track trails somewhere. Some people might like that, but I know when I do my YouTube channels, when I do just single track rides, I get a lot fewer views and likes and stuff on that. But if there's a video of me jumping my airbag or me doing a jump line somewhere, riding a skate park, whatever, those kind of things definitely draw more attention to it, and people are more interested in it. And that makes sense. People want to be entertained when they're going to YouTube and things like that. So places like Pink Bike, GMBN, people like Sam Pilgrim and stuff like that. Of course, they're going to be doing these more extreme forms of mountain biking. They're going to be teaching tricks. They're going to talk about those kind of things. But the bulk of mountain biking isn't really that, which is kind of surprising. So people get kind of a skewed idea of what mountain biking is. And that's really why I wanted to do this video, because I want people to understand that pretty much anybody can mountain bike, and just having a mountain bike, riding on single track trail, like up in Cuyuna where I ride all the time, I see families up there riding just the green single track kind of flowy trail. They're fun, it's getting outdoors, it's getting active, it's getting exercise, things like that. And every now and then there's, a bit more technical challenges, things like that, but they're not extreme, right? So, that to me is what mountain biking is riding single track. And then there's all these offshoots from it, which is fun. It falls under mountain biking, but they're, definitely the smaller amount of people do them. So there you have it. Kind of interesting thing, but one of the things that I want you to do is post in the comments, what do you think mountain biking is? What is it to you? What is mountain biking to you? What does it do for you? How do you feel about it? What is the type of mountain biking that you like? Yeah, post in the comments. Let's have this conversation. It's a pretty cool conversation to have. Sweet. I appreciate your support for my channel. Please like and subscribe. Peace.